Hello, welcome to another edition of the Intel with Greg Cosell, available only on the Inside the Birds platform. I am Jeff Mosher alongside my Inside the Birds co-host Adam Kaplan, and joining us as usual is the star of the show. He is Greg Cosell from NFL Films, and we are going to get a breakdown after several episodes, Greg, of you previewing free agents for us, NFL free agents. The Eagles have Well, they've made more than a splash. They've brought in a lot of free agents that we're going to get in with you. Real quick, we have said, Adam and I had reported, this was going to be an aggressive free agency from Howie Roseman and the Eagles, and it certainly was. As you kind of look at what they've done and all the acquisitions, you surprised at all, or did you expect this kind of rash of additions for the Eagles?
If you got to give me the additions, I was just away watching the SEC basketball tournament in Nashville, and there's so much that went on in the league. I lose sight of all the additions with all the teams. So,
all right,
I mean,
let's go through that. That's a good
White.
point.
I know White. I know Burks. They re-signed Gardner-Johnson. Who else we talking about?
So there's this running back you may have heard of named Saquon Barkley.
Oh,
yeah.
He's
Pretty good. They traded for Kenny Pickett. They added Matt Hennessy for some depth on the offensive line. And there are a couple of other smaller signings, but Zach Bond at linebacker. But yeah,
let's hit on those.
We'll get to the big ones with you.
Okay.
Everybody always loves the quarterback, right? So the Eagles trade for a backup quarterback in Kenny Pickett. He had 2 years in Pittsburgh, former first-round pick out of Pitt. Remember that you liked him coming out of Pitt. What did the tape show on his 2 years there?
See, here's a perfect example, and you don't know the reasons why. And obviously, Pickett was clearly an uncomfortable player in that offense, and we've discussed that offense under Matt Canada for the 2 years, and then obviously he was fired. And then Pickett got hurt. But what was so interesting is Pickett never looked in his short stint in Pittsburgh like he looked in college. Now, all I can do is watch the tape. I'm not there. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you for a fact that Pickett was very uncomfortable with just the whole deal that was in Pittsburgh. And I think in some ways he kind of made that clear. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a whole different conversation. But he never played the way that he played in college, and the way I thought he would have to play in the league to be, a quality starter, which, believe it or not, I still think he can be. I know after what he did in Pittsburgh, people think, oh, this guy stinks. He didn't show anything. And theoretically, he didn't. The tape will tell you that he struggled. He missed a lot of routine throws, which he did not do in college. He just looked like a very, very uncomfortable player in an offense that I don't think he was comfortable with. Obviously he's not the starter here in Philadelphia, but I think that if he had to play in a Kellen Moore offense, he could probably be effective.
Let's move on to Barkley. We talked about him in the show recently. We were breaking down the free agents, and we'll certainly look at what the other teams did, some signings and so forth. But this one was interesting because the Eagles have been looking to get out of that running back by committee. They were looking for a lead back after they let Miles Sanders walk, and Swift was good, no question about it. They had some interest in bringing him back, but they went for the home run signing in Barkley. But Greg, from your tape study, is it a home run? Where's Barkley at this point of his career, and how's he fit in here, you think, going forward?
Well, I think ultimately Barkley is a complete back in the sense that he adds a ton to your pass game, and I'm sure that was a major factor. I think as a runner, he has explosive traits. We know that he can take it to the house anytime. That's his game, much more so than being a true sustaining back. But I think when you look at what Kellen Moore wants to do, because he's very formation diverse, there's a lot of multiplicity in how he aligns players. I think you'll see a lot of that. But you don't sign Barkley to give him the ball 8 times a game. So he's going to get the ball in the run game, clearly. We know he's a very good pass receiver. And as I said, I think that's a big factor. But he's not a true sustainer. That's not really stylistically what he is, despite his size, despite the fact that he's 225, 230, with body beautiful. He's never really been that kind of runner. He's much more of an explosive big playback. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I mean, that's, and obviously at any point in the game, he can break one off. He's playing behind now a good offensive line, arguably still one of the 5 best in the league. And he certainly didn't have that with the Giants in any of the years that he was there.
Greg, how would you characterize the Giants' run schemes for the last few years under Kafka and Dable? Were they more outside zone, inside zone, duo, power? What and I'm
I
wondering
mean,
if you think
I think
Saquon fits
every
it better.
team, you know, it's funny you ask me that because I get asked that every team essentially, it's just a matter of degree of what they do.
Sure.
Every team has all these runs in their playbook.
Right.
You know, it's just a matter of what they do and what they view, you know, sort of more foundationally. But in any given game, you know, it's like the Niners. Everybody thinks, well, they're a zone run team. Well, they've added a ton more of gap scheme, you know, just because you can't do the same thing.
Sure.
You know, a lot of teams now do a lot more what we call pin pull, where they pull the tackle outside. You know, so Barkley is going to run all different kinds of runs, and he's more than capable of that. Then it becomes the nature of your opponent, the defensive fronts, you know, those kinds of things. I mean, but he's theoretically can run any scheme.
Right. I only ask because the Eagles historically, I think over the last few years especially, seem to do their best when they run inside, whether it's inside zone, whether it's duo. Obviously, you have
Right.
Jason Kelsey and you have the two big guards. And I wonder if maybe if they
Well,
continue that.
they did that a lot for the simple reason that they often double team. Kelsey is great
Yeah.
as he was, and he'll be a Hall of Famer, no question. Kelsey was not at his best if he had to block big zero techniques one-on-one.
Right.
So they normally double teamed inside because they, you know, look, even great players, you know, there's major strengths for great players, but there's still a few flaws in their games that need to be, you know, dealt with by the coaching staff. So, you know, if a team played, you know, odd fronts, an odd front meaning there was someone lined up right over the center, you know, very often the Eagles would run double teams because Kelsey, that was not the true strength of his game.
Right.
All right, let's move to defense. Zach Bond here. Greg, this is a guy that I know the Saints had some high hopes for as a third-round pick, but he never became that guy. So I know you've watched their tape. I know he didn't play a lot on defense, but what could he do in this scheme with Vic Fangio?
Well, it's interesting because Zach Bond was a pass rusher at Wisconsin. He basically was an edge player, and it never quite happened that way in the league. Now, I don't know if once they got him into camp the first year, they said, well, this guy can't rush the quarterback in the NFL, or whether they just didn't feel within their scheme because the Saints were a four-man D line. So Zach Bond was not going to be a defensive end in their four-man front. So what did they have to make him? They had to make him either a stacked backer or a strong side backer where he lined up on the ball, but he wasn't going to be a true edge pass rusher because that's not the way the Saints played. So the question is, how did the Eagles see him? Because, you know, he only played with the Saints for the most part when they played in their base defense, when they played with three linebackers, their 4-3 base. And very often he'd line up on the ball as the Sam linebacker. So he didn't play in a stacked position an awful lot. So I don't know if he was brought in with the idea that, hey, they could lose Josh Sweat. You know, who knows what happens with Hassan Reddick? You know, I don't know what their plan is because ultimately he was an edge pass rusher in college.
Interesting. And for the most of his career, he's really been a special teams player.
Right. And maybe, you know, again, I don't watch special teams, you know, so I want people to understand that, you know, so maybe he was brought in to upgrade that. You know, we don't know the answer to that, but just talking about him as a linebacker, you know, he's never really been a stacked backer in his career.
Right. Let's move to Devin White. Adam and I talked a lot about him in the last podcast, and you know, a lot of the scouting reports that we got from our personnel folks, they weren't very flattering. You know, reckless, undisciplined, makes a big play, but gives up 2 or 3 more type of scouting report there.
Well, let's look at it this way to start. Then we'll get into the player. It's a low risk move because they're taking a shot on a former top 10 player who has made impact plays in his career. Okay, but the tape's clearly declined over the last 2 seasons. We don't know why. All we can do is watch the tape. Okay, so now let's look at the player. I would say that the tape was not very good. He's looked a little heavy. He looked a little out of shape. I think he struggled to stack and shed. If he's in shape, we know he has traits. He can run and hit. He can match and carry in the pass game. He's a very, very good blitzer. You know, in a Vic Fangio defense, he'd be able to wall number 3. He can carry number 3. He's got speed. He's got closing burst. I mean, this is at his best. This is not what he was the last 2 years, but it's a low risk move. You're dealing with a guy that was a former top 10 pick. They're not paying him a ton of money. So, at a position of major need, because they had no one.
Also at that position, Oren Burks, who's been around for a bunch of years with the Packers and the Niners. What are your thoughts on him
He
and
came out.
potential?
I've liked him from the moment I saw him in college. He was a Vanderbilt kid. Now you're talking about a lean, linear frame guy, 6'3", about 230 plus, runs really well. Little tight in his lower body, but runs really well. Maybe needs to be a little faster to see it in the run game, but he's got straight line juice. He can run with tight ends and running backs. He can play in zone coverage because the Niners played a ton of zone. He can be a blitzer. Keep in mind, he had to be put in the Super Bowl when Greenlaw got hurt, and he more than held his own. Because for the Niners, he was their third linebacker when they played base. But, when guys got hurt, he was the next man up. I find him to be a really intriguing signing. It's a value signing, cost them nothing to take a shot at another linebacker, as we said, at a position of weakness.
Yeah. Also, we're noticing a little bit of I don't know if it's a philosophical shift, Greg, or just a coincidence, but Zach Cunningham was a guy who had length that the Eagles didn't typically bring in at that position. And now Oren Burks has similar length. It seems like, at least for the last 2 years, Eagles having something different size-wise at that spot.
And we don't know if that was specific, if they said, hey, we need length, or if he was just a guy who was available at a low-risk number who has a lot of experience in the league.
Right. Okay, could you see White maybe in some nickel packages, Greg, moving to an outside rusher role, like a Sam role, because he's
rushed the quarterback. He's been one of the things he has done well in his time in Tampa is be a blitzer, rush the quarterback.
Right.
It was often schemed. That's the thing. It wasn't like, hey, just rush and beat a guy. It was schemed pressure. Don't forget, it was Todd Bowles, and Todd Bowles is a big time schemer when it comes to pressure. Fangio does some of that, but Bowles is probably as high a percentage schemer of blitz as any defensive coach in the league. So, I can see it in my mind right now, the way they used him, but rarely did they use him as, hey, line up and beat the tackle. That wasn't really the way he was deployed in terms of being a pass rusher.
Got it.
Let's go to the secondary, and the guy, he's back. You mentioned Greg earlier. Gardner-Johnson is back. Yep. He was with Detroit last season. Unfortunately, he got hurt, was able to come back late, but he lost his starting job, so that was going to be it for him. But he comes here in a secondary that really needs someone who could play. He makes big plays. Greg, what are your thoughts in this scheme going forward here with Fangio?
I think he's just a really good football player. I think he can play in any scheme. Okay. I think he's a smart player, because don't forget, when you look at Vic Fangio, again, it's that whole thing where, they play quarters. Well, no, they do and they don't. They start a lot with a quarter structure, and then they move to any number of different things. They could stay in quarters, but they don't just play quarters. Gardner-Johnson can play anything. He'll line up, in that quarter structure. He can drop down. He can play deep. He's got really good range. He sees it really well. He's got great ball skills. He's just a really good football player. I remember watching him back in Florida. He was like that at Florida. He played both safety and corner. And he brings a swagger to your defense too. And I think there's not one defensive coach that doesn't like a guy that's a little bit of an a-hole in a good way. He brings a swagger to your defense.
Greg, I remember Jason Avant and Quentin Michael 2 years ago when CJ was an Eagle. Loved what he brought from a playmaking ability. Did not love what he brought from a run defense ability. I get it. He's a safety. It's the last line of defense, but there were times he'd have to come into the box, and his tackling, they would make light of that. They would not make light of it. They would bring attention to it.
Yeah, I don't think that's the true strength of his game. Mm-hmm. And he'll have to do some of that. Every safety does when you play in a quarter structure. But that's you're not signing Gardner-Johnson to be a run defender. Now, again, like I said, every safety has to do that at times. So I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't matter, but that's not why you signed Gardner-Johnson.
Right. No, I was sort of going to ask you, sort of looking in the bigger picture. If you have a guy like that, you have a guy like Devin White, who is last 2 years has really been kind of the metrics say he misses tackles at the highest percentage in the NFL. And then you already were struggling last year up front. I just feel like this is something you should look for.
Yeah, and those metrics, you know how I feel about that stuff, Jeff. I'm not
Correct.
saying it's wrong. I think that, I'd have to see, all those plays that they say are missed tackles, I'd have to see them, to know if that's a missed tackle. I mean, that's just, those metrics are very, anyway, yeah.
Subjective, yeah, because
Yeah.
Subjective, but I think it's
me,
fair to say, I mean, even the scouting reports we got is that he gets himself out of position. He doesn't.
Yeah, well,
he's not the best
White
run
has
back.
certainly, as I said, the reality is White's tape has been closer to poor the last couple of
Yes.
years.
Right.
So that's just the reality. I mean, that's the tape. All you can do is look at the tape. Like I said, we don't know why. We're not there. But the tape tells you that he has not played well the last 2 years. There was a time, maybe 3-4 years ago, where people thought he was on his way to being one of the top 3 or 4 linebackers in the league. And it just hasn't happened.
Before we move on to the next team, I want to talk about Bryce Huff. I know we talked about it in our free agency preview, but he's here now. And now Reddick is still with the team. We'll see if he is in a month from now or less. But how do you see him lining up here? More of an edge rusher type, I would think.
Well, the Bryce Huff signing is interesting to me because at the end of the day, Bryce Huff is a situational pass rusher. I mean, again, you run into that situation. We'll see what happens. There's more to happen. Did they sign him to play 50 snaps a game or 55 snaps a game? Because he's never, ever done that. I think he's a really good pass rusher, by the way. And he pretty much lines up only on the left side of the defense, which is the same side Reddick lines up on. So, again, I don't know what their plan is. Like I said, do they think of him as a full-time player? Never done it. Do they think of him as lining up on the right side if, let's say, Josh Sweat isn't here or whatever the reason? Never done it. So, again, if you watch the tape of Bryce Huff, he's around the quarterback all the time, but he's a situational pass rusher. He's really, really good at that. But, it's like that baseball analogy I often make where, there's a guy who, bats 7th and hits 30 home runs and you sign him to bat 3rd. You don't know if it's going to be the same deal. You just don't know,
right.
But he's really good at what he's been in his career. I don't know how the Eagles see him.
Fair enough.
Let me just ask you this: based on the money, Adam, do you think are they paying him full-time money?
Yes, for $17 million a year, he has to start, which means Reddick has to be moved. You can't justify paying one guy $15.5 million, which is the cash for Reddick. It's all about cash, folks. It's $17 million for the other guy. And
then play Huff, 18 snaps a game.
Yeah, so it's a fair question. Yes, obviously, and then
he's never done that, and he's never done what they, based on the money, he's never done what the money suggests they're going to ask him to do. So we don't know the answer to that.
Well, one more thing, just staying on this group, because Josh Sweat is back. They redid his deal. He took a pay cut, but they guaranteed his cash. Let's just say going forward, you got Huff and Sweat playing together as their edge rushers. What do you think of that pairing?
Huff and Sweat?
Yep.
Well, Sweat's become an interesting player because, again, all based on tape, he was not very good the last part of the season, and it almost looked like he was favoring his leg even more than he had, through the last couple of years. So again, based on what you just said, he'll be back, right? I mean, they're not going to cut him.
Yeah, he won't be cut. That's for sure.
Well, if he's not going to be cut, how do they map out the snaps here? Does Sweat become more of an inside player? Particularly, look, Vic does play a 5-man front, okay? So does Sweat move inside and essentially, I don't want to say replace Fletcher Cox, but does he become more of that guy? And then they see Huff and Reddick as edge players. I don't know. Again, these are unanswered questions right now as we talk on March 19th. I don't know.
No, what I'm saying, Greg, is let's assume they move Reddick.
You mean move Reddick and he's not an Eagle?
Yeah, let's say they trade Reddick, right? Yeah, Sweat. Let's just talk about Sweat and Huff together as a pair.
Okay. Well, I think there are questions there. I think there are because the way Sweat played at the end of last year, we'll see if he can bounce back or not. Huff as a full-time player, we'll see. Where does Nolan Smith fit into this equation now? Do they see him as being, part of the rotation? I mean, like I said, Huff's obviously going to play more than 20 snaps a game, but he may not play 55 either. They may see him playing 40. And then does Nolan Smith fit into this? How do they feel he did based on his tape, his minimal tape as a rookie? Do they feel he's ready to play 25, 30 snaps a game as part of an edge rotation? another unanswered question as we speak in mid-March.
Yeah, definitely. Last guy we'll throw at you is DeVante Parker, Greg. What do you think he can do in this offense if he makes the team? 50-50 contested catch kind of guy?
Yeah, I'm not, again, he's a total unknown because the guy is hurt all the time.
Yeah.
So he's over 30 now. He's been hurt a lot. He's had moments in the NFL where he played the way you would think that a guy with his traits should play as a 14th pick in a draft, including one game against the Eagles years ago when he was with Miami, as I recall. But I think he's a crapshoot right now. I mean, he's a guy that could not even make the team. I mean, when you sign him, people go, "Oh man, now they got the third guy because of his pedigree." And there have been moments, but and I'm being honest, Jeff, I don't know what to think of DeVante Parker.
Yeah, we're with you. He's definitely not a slot receiver. We know that. It's not.
No, he's not a slot receiver.
No, not at all.
No.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna go around the NFC East with you with some extra signings, and then talk about some the bigger signings as we fly through it. The Giants made a huge move, Greg, acquiring Brian Burns from the Carolina Panthers. Add to their pass rush. They've got Kayvon Thibodeau. I think they still have Ojulari. How do you see Brian Burns fitting in with what Shane Bowen, their new defensive coordinator, likes to do?
Fits perfectly because he's the Harold Landry for Shane Bowen. And he's better than Harold Landry.
I was going to say,
good,
except he'll be
but
good.
Burns is better. Burns is phenomenal. It's just he's been in Carolina and they've been really bad. So people, they know the name, but they don't know about him. Burns, ever since I watched him coming out of Florida State, he's Gumby. I mean, he can bend. He's a terrific pass rusher. You have to account for Burns.
Yeah.
Now I'm not saying again, the Eagles obviously feel they have two great tackles, so they may not do anything specifically. But I mean, he's one of those guys that can wreck your offense. He can bend. He's explosive. He's long. He's athletic. He's a really, really good pass rusher.
I guess you combine that with what they got from Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon Thibodeau had a decent year last year, and Ojulari. It starts to look like the Giants are putting together a little bit of a deeper.
Yeah. I mean, Burns is a far, far better pass rusher than Thibodeau. Right. Almost all of Thibodeau's sacks last year were secondary sacks. Thibodeau is not a great one-on-one pass. He's not a bad football player, but he's not a great one-on-one pass rusher.
Right.
But I wouldn't surprise me if the other thing Shane Bowen did a lot of in Tennessee, because I know Shane and I watch Tennessee all the time because I do radio, is he moves people around. So, I mean, you're going to see Burns move around. You're going to see Ojulari move around. You're going to see Thibodeau move around. They're not just going to line up in a static front.
Let's move over to a team in this division that had a lot of cap space, a lot of cash to spend, and they did it. They've added a ton of free agents. That's the Commanders, and they needed it. Their roster wasn't very good. But let's go to defense, where they're changing it up with Dan Quinn. He brings in his guy, Joe Witt Jr. from Dallas.
Yep.
George Armstrong comes over, Dante Fowler. It's just funny. All these players that DQ knows. Bobby Wagner, we'll talk about him. And then Frankie Louvu, Greg, I know you like a lot.
I love Frankie Louvu.
Let's talk about Wagner and Louvu in this defense with Dan Quinn.
Well, I would say Wagner is still a good player. I think he's gone down a little bit in terms of pass coverage. That would be the spot where I think he's not quite as good, but he sees things really well. I still think he's a good run defender. He certainly can still play at a reasonably high level. It's not like he fell off the face of the earth. Now, again, with a player that age, you never know, but he's been really good. Louvu, he's a guy that I've always really liked. He just shows up. He's a dynamic mover. He can rush the quarterback. He can play off the ball. He's kind of a complete linebacker that nobody knows about. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you he's Fred Warner, but he's, he can do a lot of things, and he's not small. He's probably, I would guess, I don't have his numbers in front of me. I would guess he's in the 245 range. He's not a small guy. So I think Frankie Louvu is a really, really good side. I mean, with Louvu and Wagner, that's a major addition at the linebacker position.
And of course, they're probably likely to draft a quarterback, and they added the center from Cowboys as well, Tyler Biadasz, which I would think, Greg, is a big upgrade from what they've had at center in the last few years.
Well, their O-line wasn't very good the last couple of years, so
yeah,
they're going to need to address that. But now with Howell gone, I mean, what quarterback's on their roster right now?
Well, Mariota will be the 2. He's being paid $6 million, and your guy Jake Fromm. So that's it. Yeah, they're going to
draft. They have to draft a quarterback, and that guy's going to start day one.
Yeah, right, for sure.
So they're going to draft because they have the second pick in the draft, right?
Yes. Do you
Yep.
think
They're
that's an
drafting a fourth.
underrated concept of having that veteran center to pair with a young quarterback like that? Because it's worked for the Eagles for a little bit here.
Yeah, I mean, do I think Biadasz is a top 3 center in the league? No, but he's a veteran who knows how to play. And yeah, no, that's really critical because he's going to have to be heavily involved in calling protections because the rookie quarterback is not going to be able to do that at a meaningful enough level. So the center is going to have to do 90% of that. And that's critical. It wouldn't surprise me if that more than Biadasz's physical traits, which are not high level relative to centers in the league, if he was brought in for that reason, because he can do all those things that the quarterback, I guess could be Daniels or May based on what you hear, who knows right now, but it's one or the other. That guy's going to start day one.
Greg, one more guy that before we move on, the Commanders went to Carolina again, and they got Jeremy Chin, and I know he looked great early in his career, and then he kind of fell off. How do you see him being used here with Dan Quinn?
Yeah, he kind of fits the Quinn mold though, if he's going to play big nickel, because don't forget they played a ton of big nickel. Just so people know what that means, that means you're playing with 3 safeties and 2 linebackers as your base defense. Which was the Cowboys' base defense under Dan Quinn the last number of years. Chin fits that perfectly. So that's a scheme fit 100%, Adam. That's a guy he's a solid football player. Don't forget, so many guys got lost in Carolina because they were just a bad football team. But he's a solid football player, good size, good movement. I don't know what his age is now, but he's not over 30. He hasn't been in the league that long. But
26.
Yeah, he's still a young player. So I think he fits exactly the way Dan Quinn sees his defense.
And obviously they let Cam Curl go. And for whatever reasons, Greg, a guy we all liked, it took him a long time to find a home, which he finally did with the
Rams.
The
And,
LA
and
Rams,
Chin's a more dynamic athlete than Curl. I like Curl a lot. We have discussed him. I know Adam, talked about him as well. And I like Cam Curl, but Chin's a more explosive athlete.
Got it. Let's take a look at some other huge signings across the NFL. I wanted to ask you about the Packers bringing in both Xavier McKinney and Josh Jacobs to add to what they did last year. Knowing what they do defensively, is McKinney going to be a major fit for them?
Well, they have a new coordinator, so we don't know exactly what they're going to do defensively.
True.
But McKinney is a complete safety. McKinney can do anything. He's I think, again, the Giants were a little bit dysfunctional the last couple of years, on defense. Wink Martindale never quite had the personnel. I think he wanted to play his defense. I think, Adam, you'd probably agree with that. But McKinney, to me, can be a really complete safety because he can play slot, he can play on the back end, he can play in the box. He did all this at Alabama, by the way. So I think, that's a really good signing. Now, health is critical. Obviously, he's got to be able to play. I thought the Jacobs signing was interesting. Maybe you guys know more about it. I really like Aaron Jones. I love what he did toward the end of last season. I know he's older than Jacobs, and he's been nicked up a little bit, as often running backs as they get older become nicked up. My guess is Jones is probably about 30 years old now, give or take.
Yep.
Jacobs is younger, but Jacobs does have a lot of tread on his tires. I think you could pick your poison here as to who you like better. We know that Matt LaFleur wants to run the football. Meaningfully run the football. So Jacobs is there to run the ball. They're going to hand him the ball. So that's the way they want to play. And then Jordan Love, we know, he clearly improved dramatically last year and is very, very gifted with those young receivers. They have a really intriguing offense.
No doubt. Their young pass target group in Green Bay is just fantastic at tight end receiver.
Yep.
Now you had Jacobs there. That's pretty complete. So let's go around the league, Greg. And one of the more underrated signings, I don't know how much he'll get the ball, but the Chiefs finally have someone who could get deep, and that's Hollywood Brown. What are your thoughts about Hollywood Brown with the Chiefs?
Yeah, he's actually not a bad receiver when he's been healthy and played. Don't forget, the Cards pass game has certainly been up and down. Murray missed, meaningful time the last 2 years. And even when he played, I don't know if their pass game was really consistent, for whatever reason. But Brown can run. I think he's actually a pretty good receiver. I think it's a good move by the Chiefs because I think Rashid Rice is going to continue to develop as a real solid type receiver. Again, when you have a good pass game, a lot of times the delineation, you don't have to say a guy's a number one or a number two, or, if you have a good pass game, guys get the ball. It's like the Rams, is Nakua a number one? No one would even say that under any circumstance, even though he had 104 catches and whatever the yardage was. No one would say, hey, he's a number one, in terms of the way people think about number one receivers. So the Chiefs have one of those pass games. A lot of guys, sort of get the ball. We'll see if Travis Kelce still remains that guy, or maybe, as he's getting older, his whatever happens, but but Brown is, it's a good spot for him within the context of that offense.
Greg, interestingly, two guys we talked about a lot in the preview, the Texans and the Vikings essentially traded edge rushers. The Vikings signed Jonathan Grenard to a big deal from Houston, and then Houston turned around and signed Danielle Hunter to a nice deal. So, how do you sort of see that juxtaposition? Is one a better fit for the other? Is one just younger simply than the other?
Yeah, it's kind of odd because, again, I don't follow the money, but was there a big money difference or not?
I think there was a year's, right? For Grenard got a long-term deal, whereas Hunter got a lot of money over a short.
Yeah, Hunter's average per season was definitely higher, but and obviously there's the age difference. But let's on Jeff's question.
If you want to talk about the player, we can just
how they fit.
Yeah.
Take whatever stance you want on it.
I really liked Grenard's tape this year. Really liked his tape a lot. He lined up at right defensive end almost all the time because Will Anderson was the left defensive end. And Grenard really showed a lot as a pass rusher. He's a little bendy, a little more flexible. Like Will Anderson had a really nice rookie season, but Grenard's the more flexible, bendy athlete. And I thought he had a really, really good season. Obviously he goes to Minnesota where it'll still be Brian Flores. And Brian Flores is one of those guys. I mean, they had the highest percentage of 3-man pressures and the highest percentage of 6-man pressures. So it's a very odd defense. It's unlike any other defense in the National Football League. But, Grenard's a good player. And now you go to Houston with Danielle Hunter. That's a serious D line because they've got Hunter and Anderson at DN. They signed a Nico Autry, who's been tremendous you talk about an under the radar signing, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Nico Autry's a really good football player who can play D end and D tackle. They have a really serious defensive line in Houston.
A couple more here for you, Greg. And the Jaguars, I know they really wanted Calvin Ridley back, but they did sign Eric Armstead, who was not willing to take a pay cut with the Niners. But Armstead to a front that really struggled. I know defensively, the Jaguars, I know they were disappointed.
They released the entire defensive staff.
Yeah, I know, and that had a lot to do with it.
Who's the new coordinator there?
It's going to be Ryan Nielsen, who comes over from Atlanta.
That's right. Oh, he's good. Atlanta did some really good stuff last year. I'm very curious, very anxious to see that.
So they had Ronald Darby, Darnell Savage comes over Green Bay, but the big one, they were able to sign Armstead after he was cut for the Niners. How do you see Armstead with Ryan Nielsen here?
Well, Armstead is a guy that can play D end or D tackle. I mean, obviously he played predominantly D tackle with the 49ers because of what else they had, but he can play both. I think he'll be an inside player in Jacksonville. That would be my guess.
Agree.
Although it was really interesting last year in Atlanta because they really didn't have edge players. So Ryan Nielsen had to play with who he had. That's all you can do. So Calais Campbell very often last year in Atlanta was an edge rusher, and he's not an edge rusher, certainly not at this point in his career. But you got to dance with the girl who brung you. So they had to they had to do what they had to do. So I don't know how they see Armstead, but I think he predominantly will play inside in Jacksonville. But just to reiterate, I think Ryan Nielsen did a really good job in Atlanta. That was a really good defense last year for a team that, offensively was challenged at times.
Right. Greg, the Titans were an offense that had started to get slower and more lumbering, right? Not dynamic. You had Derrick Henry there and DeAndre Hopkins, and they go blow the water out to bring in Calvin Ridley after they had already signed Tony Pollard. So as they try to surround Will Levis with some weapons here to go downfield and to make some big plays.
Yeah, there's no question they're changing everything. I mean, now they need O-linemen in the draft.
Badly.
That's what they've got to build up. But yeah, everything's changed there. They wanted speed. They wanted players who can move, line up anywhere. Both Pollard and Tyjae Spears can line up anywhere in the formation. So can Ridley. This really helps DeAndre Hopkins because Ridley has vertical ability. He can help regulate a defense. They had no vertical ability. They're still counting on Treylon Burks to, see what he can do if he can stay healthy. I mean, they've got a tight end that can run in Akwenko. So all of a sudden they've got players that they have dimensions on offense. That's what every team wants, dimensions on offense. They don't want to feel they have to play one way. They want to be able to attack all areas of the field. The Titans now have dimensions on offense, but if they can't protect, which they clearly couldn't a year ago, and it was, believe me, like I said, I watch their tape every week because I do radio down in Nashville. It was as bad an O-line as we've seen in the league in a while. So as you guys know, they cut Andre Dillard, and I don't know if he'll get another job. But their O-line was really, really bad. So they have to address that. Now they brought in Bill Callahan to be the O-line coach, and he's among the best who's ever done it. So, I don't know how he feels about players that they have that maybe he can turn into players, or whether they feel they need a major, major overhaul. They did sign Lloyd Cushenberry at center, and another kind of under the radar, really solid center.
Yeah.
Staying in the AFC, let's go to the Steelers, who kind of shook things up. They've changed their quarterback room completely. Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, Greg. With Arthur Smith calling the plays here, we know there's been some struggles with Russell Wilson, to say the least, but how do you feel with Russell Wilson, George Pickens working together with Freiermuth, though they need some help at receiver, trading DeVante Johnson? What are your feelings with Russell Wilson here with the Steelers?
I think they just signed Terry Bradshaw, too, this morning.
Did they? Really?
Yeah.
Really? They need number 3.
Yeah.
Only after Cordell Stewart turned them down. So
exactly. I mean, they've said that Wilson's going to be the starter. So I think, given what Arthur Smith has done in his career, and this is all we have. We don't know if he's going to change. We don't know any of that. But what we know is there's going to be a lot of play action because they're still going to start with the run game. That's the way Arthur Smith has always played offensive football. And I think that's the way Mike Tomlin wants his offense to look. He wants a physical, we can knock your what in the dirt kind of offense. They still have Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. I think that's the way they'll start. They'll try to be a play action team. Can Russell Wilson execute that well? Theoretically, he can. He's not. What you're trying to get with Wilson is you're trying to create a pass game that defines it as clearly as possible for Wilson, because at his core, he's not a timing rhythm player. So you have to try to define it as clearly as possible, which play action often helps you do, because he needs to play with some kind of timing and rhythm. I mean, at some point in the league, you got to do that. Now, he'll always put up numbers. He doesn't throw a lot of picks. So when you look at the numbers, people go, man, he's a really good player, but he isn't. So you really have to help him.
Got it. Good stuff. Oh, and Patrick Queen added to the team, which is, by the way, the Steelers are not a big free agency team.
But they were like the Eagles. They had no linebackers. They had 0 linebackers, and Queen's a good player. Queen's he's just, the question with Queen is he had a really good season this year. Did not have a great season the year prior. The question is, did he have a great season? And this is an unknown, because he was playing with Roquan Smith and he was surrounded by a really good defense and a great scheme. Or is he so good that he can be the foundation of your defense? Because in a sense, that's what he kind of is now.
Right. Crazy how many stack linebackers on the move between Queen and
Kenneth Murray, who was in Murray was in the same draft, and he signed with Tennessee. And I actually liked Kenneth Murray more than Queen coming out. Obviously, it hasn't played out that way. And I'm sure people will now tell me I'm an idiot on Twitter. But Kenneth Murray is, a big athletic guy. Never quite worked out. I don't know if he sees it fast enough. And I'm not a coach, so I don't know exactly how you help that. But he's really a big athletic guy. And, Tennessee's another team that needed linebackers. So, it's funny how a lot of teams needed linebackers. And
Yep.
maybe they looked at the teams that were in the Super Bowl and the Final Four and said, you know what, maybe the position kind of does mean something.
Well, maybe, perhaps. Now, what means something to us is you getting back in the lab and starting to dive into those college prospects, because on the next episode of the Intel with Greg Cosell next week, we start our NFL draft preview with you. And we'll talk behind the scenes about what position group we're going to do first. I'm going to give a little tease to the audience. We won't let you know
All right.
until a little bit later. All right. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Get back in the lab, my friend. Thanks for everything. That has been another great edition of the Intel with Greg Cosell. For Greg Cosell and Adam Kaplan, I'm Jeff Mosher. You've been watching the Intel with Greg Cosell.